Hello, welcome along to episode 231 of Adventures in Pop. My name is Simon Jacobs, and in this episode, I've got two subjects to touch on. One is a return to the subject I talked about a couple of weeks ago, Alex Warren. We'll come on to that in just a second. And then the majority of this episode, I want to talk about Robbie Williams. I went to see him in concert last night at the Emirates Stadium in London. And, there's quite a lot to unpack. It was a fun evening and a bit mad because, we're with Robbie, aren't we? So let's start with Alex Warren, shall we? Look, I talked about him 2 weeks ago, and the reason I talked about him 2 weeks ago was that he was then number one in the singles chart in the United Kingdom for a 10th week. And I said at the time, if he makes it to 11, then he equals the longest running number one hit of this decade. That's the 2020s, and I think by 11 weeks he was equaling an Ed Sheeran track. I can't even remember which one it was. And then if he made it beyond 11, then he was really into the kind of rarefied, higher strata where the air is thin, where he's almost in outer space. And the news is, predictably, that he has done that. And there were signs of this right from the very beginning, and I think I mentioned this, which was that his single was behaving differently than most other tracks that get to number one. Once most tracks get to number one, they start running out of steam fairly quickly. They've expended their energy in getting to number one and maybe staying for 2 or 3 weeks. And then gradually, like a balloon with a little hole in, the life just gradually goes out of it and off it goes down the charts. Well, the opposite was happening to this Alex Warren single. And as it sort of got into its stride, number one, it was opening up a wider and wider gap between it and the number two tracks as the weeks went by, showing no signs really of deflating. Or if it was by a few percent, not really a major kind of, crash. So here we are, Alex Warren, Ordinary, 12 weeks number one, which makes it, and this is the important thing, it makes it the 7th longest number one in UK history. So, yeah, there are 6 other tracks up ahead of him. If he just carries on for another, I think the absolute record is about 18 or 19 weeks. If he carries on for another couple of months, and that's quite a tough task, let's be honest. 12 weeks is phenomenal in itself. But if he were to carry on for another 6 or 7 weeks, maybe 8 weeks, I think he would then hold the record as the longest number one ever in history. I don't think that's possible, but 12 weeks is still amazing. And I think all we can say is that Ordinary is Far From by Alex Warren. Okay, let's get on to Robbie. Went to see Robbie at the Emirates Stadium. Now, look, the Emirates Stadium is a nice stadium. I mean, I'm not an Arsenal fan, but it's quite a beautiful stadium. It has a nice aesthetic structure. When you're inside, it kind of feels good. It's a nice size. It's a really good place to have a concert because you're not that far away. Yes, it's a stadium. It holds whatever it is, 50, 60,000 people, more when you're filling the whole football pitch with people as it was yesterday. But it's actually quite a nice venue. We saw a bit of Rag and Bone Man, who was the support act. What a good voice he's got. He a very impressive voice. Very, it's loud and powerful, but spot on in tune and good on him. And then we waited, and the clouds got more threatening above us. I've got to say, look, basically the weather was terrible. As the concert started, as the lights went down for the beginning of Robbie, the heavens opened. And I think most people kind of were prepared because the weather forecast had been so horrible and the weather earlier the day had been horrible. So people were wearing, waterproofs and cagoules and all manner of waterproof equipment. So it didn't disrupt anything too much, but it was a very wet start to the concert. It was, dramatically pouring on us, hailstones, the whole stuff, as Robbie made his entrance. He was on stage for the best part of a couple of hours, and he covered all the hits that you would expect him to cover. And I kind of joked with my partner who I was with that every Robbie Williams gig, from now until the end of time has to start with "Let me entertain you," and every Robbie Williams gig from now to the end of time has to end with "Angels," and so it was. There was actually slightly unfair because there was a kind of even earlier song that he did, which apparently is a song from a new album that happened just before he got into "Let Me Entertain You." But really, "Let Me Entertain You" was the beginning of the show, and as you would expect, "Angels" was the end of the show. And in between, we got costume changes, we got stories, a lot of Robbie chatting with the audience, and I mean all very carefully pre-scripted, I have to say, because I think it was exactly the same as in all the other concerts he's doing in this tour. So not very spontaneous, but kind of fun all the same. And what a strange thing a Robbie Williams gig is. It's this strange mixture of, kind of high campery, of a very British sort, mixed with some really good material. And actually, this is a really important point. Robbie Williams can do these gigs because he's building off a foundation of really very good pop songs. And we should remind ourselves just how successful he was in his pomp. When you look back at albums like "Sing When You're Winning" and "Escapology," I think they sold many, many millions of copies. And, he is one of the most successful male pop stars that the country's ever produced when you look at the numbers, look at the stats. So he's got a big back catalogue to work from, and that certainly helps him, because there's so much that's familiar to an audience like this, who, by the way, I would say was quite an attentive audience. There's a lot of love there. They knew the words of pretty much everything, whether it was a big hit single or an album track. And average age, I would say, is probably about Robbie's age. Robbie is now 51, and I would say that was about, average for this audience. And it was really interesting. He referred back to a comment he'd made, 20 years ago, apparently, at a gig where he'd said to the audience, "Will you grow old with me?" This is typical Robbie. It's kind of heart-touching and sort of makes you think, oh, he's a nice guy. Yes, I'm going to be loyal to him forever and ever. So he apparently had said, "Would you grow old with me?" And here he is, the age of 51, looking out across an audience who were kind of his age. So what makes it so, I suppose so odd, and I think this is worth just touching on. Okay, first of all, there were a couple of odd things that happened in the concert itself. So on two occasions, using the screens on either side of the stage, they put together an AI kind of character of Robbie when he was a teenager, so that Robbie on stage can talk to Robbie as he's a teenager. Quite odd. And then a little bit later on, they did the same thing again, but this was Robbie as an 80-year-old, now talking to Robbie in 2025 as a 51-year-old. So we had a look back at old Robbie, in theory, and a look ahead to new Robbie that hasn't yet arrived. Quite weird. And not really necessary either. And I guess this points, maybe my one drawback here, my one slight area of nervousness with Robbie is he's very needy. He needs the audience to adore him. And he overshares. I think he always has done, but I think he's telling us too much. So we had a lot of stuff about his beautiful family, and I'm sure his family are beautiful. Beautiful wife, 4 beautiful kids. He was quite funny about it because he pretended that he couldn't remember the 4th one's name. There's stuff like that. It's quite deprecating, but still, he talked a lot about his family. He came back to it several more times. And he talks a bit about his breakdowns, his mental health issues. He talks about how this is the happiest he's ever been now. And whenever somebody who's had therapy starts telling me that now they're in a really good place and this is the happiest they've ever been, I always worry about that. I always think, you're on the edge of another crash or something. I don't want to hear that, because I think if you really are in that space, you probably don't have to tell everybody. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, and maybe I'm being very unfair, but it's like he's over persuading us. He's having to slightly over argue his case, and that is a concern. At one point, he told the audience that he was in Sniper's Alley because I think both his mother and his father have had or are getting Alzheimer's and begin to lose their memory and senile, and he's thinking that dementia is something that is coming his way, and that may or may not be true, but again, quite an interesting, odd thing to share with the audience. And what else can I tell you? I think with Robbie, there's a very strong connection between Robbie and this kind of British audience, and it means that I think he can get away with more than maybe other pop stars could do. He is more successful than most other pop stars. But B, I think we give him a bit of extra leeway because it's Robbie. And he's a lucky boy because I think we've just found a place in our heart, a Robbie-sized place in our hearts that enables him to still be crazy, tell us too much, still sing his hits. He still refers back to being, the fat boy from Take That. Now, that was a comment that was made, I think, by one of the Oasis brothers, 20-something years ago, and he still kind of rolls it out for you. And I think that tells you a lot of what you need to know. So last night, as the weather gradually improved over the space of that 2 hours, from the total downpour at the beginning to just a bit, wet and bedraggled by the end, Robbie did keep us entertained without any doubt. There's no doubt about that. I heard somebody saying as we shuffled out afterwards, you can always rely on Robbie to have a good night out. And I thought, well, yes, absolutely you can. And it's going to be a good night out littered with, examples of the kind of therapy he's been going through, and lots of, me about Robbie, which he does really quite endearingly. So it's not like you go away thinking, oh, for God's sake, Robbie, shut up. You just think, oh, he's a sweetie, but he's quite a bonkers sweetie. And that's probably what I need to say. My favourite Robbie Williams song, just for the record, is Feel. I think it's a really, really good track. And he did save it for his encore. He did two songs as encore, Feel, and then, of course, the inevitable, inescapable Angels. And as Angels played, we sort of shuffled ourselves out to the side of the stadium so that we could make a reasonably quick getaway. But yeah, a fun night. There is apparently a new Robbie album. I'm not quite sure what else would have been the reason for him to do this stadium tour, but there is a new album coming out soon, I think called Britpop. Apparently it's a kind of guitar-y sort of album, and it's the album that he said he always wanted to make when he first left Take That. So, we'll see how that goes for him. It's good to have him around. He's definitely one of Britain's eccentrics. And it was, as the chap behind me said, you can always rely on him for a good night out. It was a good night out, despite the weather. Okay, enough. Thank you very much indeed for listening. Oh, by the way, having got right to the end of this, you're definitely the kind of person who should subscribe. So why not? Subscribe and like and all the rest of those things. And I thank you. And I'll be back very soon with some more music, probably some music of mine. So hold your breath. No, don't hold your breath. See you later. Bye-bye.